Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Nick.
And I'm Alistair.
And this fortnight, as the last 2 years' worth of film releases continue to splurge over us in one long continuous fire hosing, we've got the latest MCU film, Eternals, and then the new Edgar Wright movie, Last Night in Soho. But before all of those things, Alistair, what else have you consumed in the last fortnight?
So I've been watching a new sci-fi show that's on Apple TV, continuing to make the most of the free year of Apple TV I've got. This show is called Invasion, and it's a premise I've seen done before, but it's done in an interesting way, in which the plot line follows multiple characters all over the world, sort of ordinary people who witness an alien invasion. It starts with some strange things happening, like power outages, computers stop working, objects falling down from the sky and it's sort of exploding things. There's an attack on a space station. And then it builds slowly the sense of there's a mystery, there's something strange going on. The various characters' personal lives and character plots are kind of weaved in with this wider mystery. It's interesting so far. They've been releasing it like an episode a week on Apple TV, and there's a real sense of like tension and mystery behind it. I'm interested to see when it gets to the point of having to actually reveal some things and do some explanation, whether the reveals will live up to the, sense of suspense they've built up or the sense of mystery. But they've certainly managed to create an intriguing mystery so far, so we'll see where it goes.
Okay, so it could be good or it could be the next Lost.
Yeah, that's very much the sort of point we're at. It's not that it's easy to create a sense of mystery or a sense of suspension, but I guess it is like a trick I have seen in a lot of like film and TV makers' bags, which is like, how strange things happening, characters trying to find out what's going on, a sort of looming sense of like something's coming. But yeah, you've got to at some point reveal the baddie or show some kind of explanation to what's going on. I guess it's similar to a lot of horror movies when you start out with something mysterious, weird and scary happening, but then at some point you do have to like show the monster.
Well, yeah, especially with TV shows when, you have this sort of open-ended brief where you theoretically could drag it out forever, but, there'll be a point where people will just snap.
Yeah, and there's obviously it's quite a large scope. There's, sort of 6 or so main characters from all over the world, who are connected. I assume the characters will meet up at some point or overlap in some way. I guess a la Heroes, a sort of similar show that began with a kind of mysterious what's going on sort of premise. But it is interesting so far. Cast is very good. Sam Neill is probably the most famous name in it. There's some surprises and twists along the way so far, which I won't spoil now, but some unexpected things that happen. There are a few moments when it does throw up some very generic melodrama. Yeah, a few of the kind of personal stories weaved into the alien invasion plot occasionally swerve into like soap level obvious drama. There's one plot line which involves like a mother of 2 children discovers her husband's having an affair through some incredibly lack of hiding his affair. And you do kind of think like, this is fairly obvious, just melodrama, just to ratchet up the emotional level a bit. But other than that, it is a good show.
Yeah, I don't think I haven't seen much chat about this, so I didn't really know much about it. The name sounds like it should be the revival of something old, but based on glancing at the Wikipedia page, it's actually just a very generic name.
Yeah, it is a bit of a generic name. I think it sort of accurately just conveys what the TV show's about. Yeah, I'm surprised this hasn't made more of an impact. I don't know if it's because it's on Apple TV and not that many people just have Apple TV. I mean, they seem to be pushing it in a big way. Lots of ads when you open the Apple TV app. It's similar to Foundation, the other show on Apple TV I'm watching right now. It's got lots of beautiful shots. Lots of money's been spent on making it look good in effects budgets, and they're filming all around the world, and there's some quite big scenes involving lots of people trying to like escape a city at one point. There's not a shortage of beautiful shots and money being spent on it, but maybe it's just not having that impact because it's hard to watch.
To be fair, I guess Ted Lasso managed to make a fairly big impact despite being on Apple TV, so it's not an impossible dream.
Yeah, and Ted Lasso is mainly a show about people hanging around in offices and locker rooms and saying funny things to each other. It's weird. It must be the...
There's not even a single alien. Jesus Christ.
No, exactly. I mean, there's a few high-profile like cast people, but it must have been one of the cheapest things that they made, considering the amount of money they spent to like Foundation and things like that. But this is the one that's cut through. I guess it means that like there's more to making a great show than just lavish effects and beautiful shots.
I mean, for a lot of the time, the most influential shows on the planet were like sitcoms, which just involve people sitting around in circles, or I guess occasionally crime procedurals. It seems to have only been since Game of Thrones and the Marvel Cinematic Universe that people have started to wonder if what people actually want is massive amounts of special effects.
I guess TVs have got bigger, so effects have more of an impact when you watch them at home, and also effects have got a lot cheaper, I guess. In the 90s, TV budgets just wouldn't stretch to special effects and computer graphics. They were just so expensive. But now they've become cheap enough that even like an ambitious show can stretch to CGI creatures and special effects, so they've become more common.
Well, yeah, it's true. I just see people say one of the reasons Doctor Who came back in 2005 is that the BBC could finally afford to do the special effects in a way that looked at least all right.
Yeah, exactly.
Rather than looking like an embarrassment compared to the American shows at the moment.
Yeah. And, as effects got cheaper, Hollywood films with even bigger budgets have just become more and more effects heavy. Films we've discussed recently, like recent Marvel films, and probably the one we're going to discuss today, you get the feeling like an enormous amount of this has clearly been shot on a green screen and then done digitally later. Probably because it's the cheapest way to do this.
Well, yeah. Feels like a lot of the Marvel shows are shot entirely on green screens.
Yeah, but I would recommend Invasion if you've got an Apple TV account. Yeah, there's a good sense of mystery. I'm interested to see where it goes. I might check back in later or put it on Twitter when we actually get to the renovation stage and see if it lives up.
Okay, I hope that day actually comes.
Yeah.
I hope it actually does reach the revelation.
Anyway, that's what I've been up to recently. Nick, do you have anything to recommend to our listeners?
Yeah, in the last couple of days, have finished watching the first season of the swearily named TV show Kevin Can Fuck Himself. Kevin Can F Himself, technically, as I believe it is on a US broadcast network, and they probably won't let you say fuck in the title. But it does sort of, in a slightly obfuscated way, say fuck on screen in the opening of the show. Anyway, this is, of course, the new series starring Annie Murphy, who played the daughter Alexis in Schitt's Creek, and is now playing a sitcom wife who steps outside of the sitcom she's in a sort of on-screen demarcated way. Like there's sections of the show whenever the husband and his sitcom gang are on screen are like brightly lit and shot like a sitcom. There's only like one or two camera angles, that sort of thing. And then as soon as the husband and his mates leave the room, the colour drains from the screen and it's shot from more sort of premium crime angles. Yeah, it's about the sitcom wife Alison, played by Annie Murphy, who just gets steadily more depressed and disillusioned with her life as basically the laughing stock and punching bag. Not literal punching bag, I guess I should stress. He doesn't actually beat her up, but he does otherwise just treat her like either a killjoy or a doormat. For a show where a large chunk of it is sitcom, it's impressively depressing. There's a definite, real commitment to, especially in the first couple of episodes, hammering home what an unbearable bummer Alison's life is. I was vaguely aware what the premise was, but I was not quite prepared for just how depressing watching the show would at times be. Although, thankfully, once she, decides to try and do something about her situation, which I guess I shouldn't spoil as it's one of the major plot moves in the first couple of episodes, yeah, it does pick up and get a bit of momentum, and a big part of it, to an extent, is her actually, finding herself a little bit. And although she does, make some bad decisions, there is, I think, a lot of the thrust of the show is she also kind of a bad person in a slightly less obnoxious way? It does, slowly give her a network and a supporting cast. And yeah, it's interesting. When you first hear of this show and the sort of camera style switching move they've got, this sort of fallback joke, you do wonder, is this going to get repetitive? But so far, the character writing is good enough, and I've watched a whole season of it, and I'm still up for watching a bit more. I'm interested to see how they can push it forward to stop it just getting samey.
Yeah, I've heard a lot about this show, and a lot of people have praised it. It sounds really interesting. My concern about it would be how to balance the two tones, like the comedy and the dark, depressing social realist drama, that kind of, to make sure that the two reinforce each other, they're not kind of undermining each other.
Well, they're not really two shows together. I mean, apart from a couple of episodes, the dark, realistic version is, I'd say, about 2/3, 3/4 of the screen time. That's clearly the show you're watching. The sitcom is something that she's occasionally stuck in.
Right, I see. So yeah, it's mainly interpreted as a sort of drama with these odd funny moments or bits when it changes perspective.
Well, yeah, I mean, you're so clearly in the world of Alison and her sort of dark crime realism world that, when it does go into sitcom mode and you're kind of aware of, the dark undercurrents of just how miserable Alison is about this, there are jokes, and they are quite well written jokes. It is entirely possible to laugh at the sitcom, but you kind of feel bad doing it.
That's interesting, yeah, like a difficult thing to pull off, but yeah, sounds like it would work well if pulled off well.
I mean, the sitcom, I think, it's the sort of thing that is quite dated and would get, somewhat dragged online for being sexist, if not for the fact that the show is obviously breaking its back to make it clear, but yes, we know.
Yeah, a lot of it strikes me as like a commentary on, like especially like 90s or 80s, like network sitcoms like King of Queens or something like that.
I think it is a direct commentary on a sitcom called Kevin Can Wait, which I don't think really picked up much traction over here, but which was a very particularly standard and surprisingly recent example of a sort of lovable, schlubby, useless husband and his downtrodden wife. I think the reason they've picked Kevin Can Wait to take shots at is because they just wrote his wife out between seasons or something that they thought was particularly ridiculous.
Wow, that is a bold decision to make, and also, yeah, really shows that how little character or how much a part of the show that she was if she could just disappear between seasons and it not be explained.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, it's also, as far as I can tell, a particularly direct parody. Like, I've never seen Kevin Can Wait. I'm not even sure I could watch Kevin Can Wait if I wanted to, and it does not affect my enjoyment of Kevin Can Fuck Himself.
Yeah, I think a lot of these sort of sitcoms are, again, the sort of thing that The Simpsons was sort of spoofing. These kind of like domestic sitcoms that were very popular in the 70s, 80s and 90s in America. But yeah, obviously the Simpsons are supposed to be showing almost like a darker side to the kind of domestic family sitcom.
I mean, The Simpsons seems to have gone round the other side to the point where it's almost just become a standard family sitcom.
Yeah, and it's also just become utterly ridiculous. It's not really based on reality anymore because they've done like everything they could possibly do in the sort of 38 seasons or however many they've had at this point. So yeah, I guess when it began, it was definitely, I guess, kind of riffing on domestic family sort of suburban set sitcoms that are very popular in America.
Yeah, and it's definitely partly taking a few shots at that and partly doing this sort of domestic person plunges into a life of sudden crime type scenario, which I mean, there have been a few shows that sort of put crime and domestic life next to each other. Things like Weeds to things like Dexter.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's surprisingly kind of in that tradition in the end.
That sounds good. Yeah, this is definitely something I would like to watch, and it's on the list of TV shows to watch.
Yeah, no, decent show. It's on Amazon Prime in the UK if people want to grab it.
Next, in this episode, we will be discussing Eternals, the latest Marvel film directed by Oscar winner Chloe Zhao, and starring an enormous cast including Angelina Jolie, Kit Harington, Richard Madden, Gemma Chan, Selma Hayek, and lots and lots of other names. The Eternals have been on Earth for 7,000 years, sent here by a powerful celestial being to protect humanity from the Deviants, monsters who attack humans. In present day, they believe that they have wiped out the Deviants 500 years ago, but when a new type of Deviant arises and the Eternals' leader, Ajax, is killed, the Eternals must reunite and find out what is going on. This is an ambitious film that covers 7,000 years of history, many characters, and a story that's cosmic in scope. We saw it last night, so Nick, what did you think of it?
Well, this has definitely taken a mild pasting in the reviews, in fact in some of them quite a hard pasting, and as a result I did go in with my expectations a bit moderated, and I ended up coming out thinking, yeah, that was okay. I didn't hate it. I found it's one of those times where the established content creator has tried something different. I mean, we must give them credit for trying something different. And then, unfortunately, we must say, but does it entirely work? And it's difficult, because I find there's a lot more attempts at, like, thoughtful interpersonal drama in this film, which I thought was quite interesting compared to the slightly glib characterizations you get in a lot of Marvel films. But, unfortunately, due to the sheer volume of characters and the sheer massive volume of exposition that's got to be got through to get everything in place, it's sometimes hard to really get into the characters and care that much. Like, apart from the lead characters, who I guess the main two are probably Gemma Chan's Cersei and Richard Madden's Icarus, you don't get a huge amount of time with every character. Kumail Nanjiani from Silicon Valley is here as well, playing Kingo. The one character who does seem like he could be in any other Marvel film, the funny guy. Yeah, it's difficult, because on the one hand, I did find the mythology kind of interesting, and I did think the plot went in some good directions. Like, there's a couple of twists in this film, especially a big twist towards the end, which I think I can get through this review without spoiling, but we'll see how we go. Which I was like, wow, that's a good twist. I was not expecting that. I'm surprised and more invested now. But at the same time, I don't know, during the first twist, I found myself thinking, this is definitely a big twist, but I don't know if I was interested enough and invested enough in the pre-twist status quo to care enough for this to land. Like, honestly, I mostly came away from this thinking they should maybe have either toned down the scale a bit, or just made a TV show to actually give all of this stuff time to breathe.
Yeah, it is one of those things that might work better as premium TV because of the volume of characters and the kind of scope that they're covering in terms of both the time period it's set across and the galactic nature of the story. I mean, there is a lot going on here. There are, about 8 or so main characters, and each one is given like a thing, basically, to make them more than just a generic hero. Some of them are explored more than others, and some of them we get to find out more about them as a character. And then there's also the kind of interweaving plot of their history and their galactic fight against the deviants that they're involved in. And there is a lot going on here, and it's done in a quite serious, straight-up way. This is probably one of the least funny of the Marvel films they've made. It's got a lot less jokes than the average, Marvel film. It's not got zero, but obviously I think that's deliberate. It's not this film is unfunny, it's just more it's striving for a different tone. And I guess the strength of the Marvel Cinematic Universe is that they are always moving forward, they're always introducing new characters, they're always keeping it fresh, which means new people can be drawn in. It means that you don't have to follow every single film to go and watch a new one because there's always something fresh being brought in, and it keeps it interesting and exciting. So those are all positives about this film, that it is, something different, something unusual. Again, they've hired another indie director, which they like to do, but this one's won an Oscar and does absolutely beautiful cinematography. There is just so much going on here that most of it only really gets down to the surface. Like, the characterization isn't particularly rich. There isn't really much involved with characters changing or evolving throughout, partly because there's just so many of them and there's so much plot. And it is still a 2.5 hour film, so I wouldn't recommend there being more of it. But I do think we only really got to the surface of what was going on.
Yeah, it's difficult because Chloe Zhao's got this sort of quite slow, thoughtful style she's engaging in here, which is similar to what she was doing in Nomadland. There's a lot of lingering on moments, and it's very nicely shot, but there's still just not enough time with the characters for it to necessarily feel resonant. It's weird. Part of me wishes it wasn't quite as drab. There's a certain, on the one hand, there are some beautiful shots here of the environments. A lot was made, I think, in a couple of the old pre-match interviews of Chloe Zhao's ability to take amazing shots of landscapes. And, this does definitely have a lot more visual flair to it in that way than a lot of Marvel films, which just take place in generic settings. The old warehouse, secret facility, generic room. But part of me did come out me wishing it was slightly more, colourful somehow, or visually exciting. Because although it's very visually attractive in terms of its landscape and angles, but the palette is very drab and blue.
There are some scenes in this film that are just stunningly beautiful to look at. It's structured through a series of flashbacks, filling in the sort of 7,000-year history of the Eternals. And there's one set in ancient Babylon, and it's just absolutely, beautiful to look at, and it's kind of colourful. And there's Indian wedding scene, and there's even within some moments, there's a bit, I think it's in the trailer, when a bus comes flying towards one of the characters, and they kind of turn it into this sort of red pigment that kind of floats away. And every so often there's a moment you're just like, wow, that is stunningly beautiful. But then when it gets to some of the core dramatic moments, it is just sort of people in rooms arguing with each other. It doesn't seem that the visual flair of some moments penetrate through the entire film. And some of the sort of fight sequences, especially I think towards the end of the film, are generic superhero fighting scenes. I mean, they're spectacular, they're entertaining, they look good on the big screen, but it's not something we haven't seen before. And I know some reviewers have kind of said was basically Chloe Zhao handled a Marvel template and given certain moments to basically really express herself in that. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but it does seem like there are moments when basically she got to do what she wanted to do and it looked beautiful, and then moments when Marvel did what they wanted to do and it looks like a Marvel film.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately it is a Marvel film, 'twas ever thus. But yeah, there is a certain lack of interestingness in the way these particular superheroes move and fight. They are just, a lot of the time it is often just come down to a sort of generic energy powers type thing, or, the old staring at each other looking constipated some of the time. Yeah, looking deeply constipated whilst waving your hands around and things fly out of them, which can kind of work if you're into it and fully engaged in the beauty of the universe, but if you're finding the film's going on a bit and is possibly a bit overly riddled with exposition, can sometimes be a bit much. But yeah, it's a shame, because I do think there's an interesting story in here, and I do think that mostly thanks to the acting, which is all pretty good, and the thoughtfulness with which Chloe Zhao shot it, I do think a lot of the characters come across as having some level of distinct personality. I just think we could possibly have got under the skin a bit more. A lot of them came to their big moments in ways where you sort of think, well, this would probably have a lot more impact if I'd spent more than one scene previously with this character.
Yeah, which is one of the strengths of it, is that each character has a sort of defined personality and an aspect to them. So each character's given their moment, so they seem like a real person. But some of the plot lines don't seem to evolve or sort of go anywhere. The character has their thing. It just comes back to the kind of massive scope. I mean, they are, you say, making a superhero film, so what comes first is the plot, and there are interesting plot twists and good action sequences. And considering this film is 2.5 hours long, I didn't find my attention wandering. I wasn't sitting there thinking about what I was going to have for dinner. I was very much immersed in it, and that's partly because of how beautiful it was to look at, but partly it was because it is the Marvel competence machine that we've talked about before. They know, if you've got to have an action scene here to keep people's attention, at this point you've got to build towards a plot twist that keeps it interesting. Here's the big sort of spectacular end bit. It's not like they've made a bad film. I think a lot of people are sitting there, they want Marvel to stumble at one point, because this is the 26th film in the cinematic universe. It's been going for more than 10 years, and there are a couple of turkeys, but generally the success rate is quite high. And I thought there was a bit of element for this, that people kind of want Marvel to fail at some point and make a bad film, and almost some like schadenfreude over this. I don't think that's really fair to be like, oh, this is the time Marvel's really screwed up, because this is like a very entertaining film that was enjoyable. And it's not the worst Marvel film, it's just not firing on all cylinders.
I mean, yeah, there are worse Marvel films than this, only because there are Marvel films which are both quite generic, runs through the template, and also aren't very good. Like, they just seem a bit boring and lifeless. I mean, the obvious examples people always give of this are For the Dark World and Incredible Hulk, and also Iron Man 2. You know, films which just don't have much to recommend them other than it's another Marvel film, or films you honestly just can't say anything about. It's not that, but I don't think it entirely works. I think it is probably it probably does count as a slight misfire, because I don't think it seems like it quite works in the form it's in. As I say, I don't know if you could make a TV show with this volume of star power and this amount of special effects, but I would have watched it. It's annoying because, you know, they are trying something different and you want to give them a pat on the head for it, and there's a lot of stuff that works, especially, the acting and Chloe Zhao's visuals. There's a lot there to like, and there's enough there to enjoy, as long as you're, inclined enough towards this sort of superhero storytelling, but you're not going to just get annoyed on that principle. I could watch a mediocre and slightly flawed superhero film and be fine with it. Other people, I'm guessing, enjoy the good superhero films, and as soon as the film slightly stumbles, they immediately go, well, fuck this.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it might be one of those we say, this is one for the fans. Like, say, if you're only going to see one film this month in the cinema and you've not seen Dune, for example, then go see Dune. But if you really like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or you really like Chloe Zhao, then definitely go see this. I was thinking that these films are sort of aimed at kind of teenagers. It's a 12A certificate. It did say moderate fantasy violence, which I was very pleased about on the PBFC certificate card at the beginning. Part of me was thinking that, considering this is mainly aimed at teenagers, that's the kind of the core target. And I was thinking, if I was a teenager, I would have loved this film. It's bright, it's colourful, it's got, a range of characters that you can relate to on some level. It's not just, I don't know, there's a way you can engage with it, and it does work on that level. I guess it doesn't stand up to kind of more detailed critical analysis, but there are things to say about it. It's interesting. It's really striving to do more than just be, the 26th installment in the MCU. And that is where I guess it's both most interesting, but also where it's most flawed.
Yes, it's possible it may be one of these interesting failures we occasionally like to mention.
Yeah, there's lots of bits and pieces I could pick up about how I liked, individual things, like there's great use of Time by Pink Floyd, like a favourite song of mine. The character performances are strong across the board. And it does also, at the end, pivot towards some interesting future films. So maybe this will be one of those things that now they've introduced everything, the second one will be a lot better.
Yeah, and I'll be interested to see if it does lead to anything going forward, if there is more of this sort of tone. And yeah, it says the Eternals will return at the end. Mild spoiler, I guess. There's a card at the very end saying Eternals will return. But I hope they follow through with that in a way, because I would kind of like to see them try and develop this. I don't know if that means Chloe Zhao will return or not. On the one hand, her voice is quite all over this. On the other, I imagine making this is quite a labour-intensive process, and she may have other things she wants to do.
I guess tune back into the podcast and find out if we review the next one. Next up, this episode, we'll be discussing Last Night in Soho, a new film from Edgar Wright, starring Thomasin McKenzie, Anya Taylor-Joy, and Matt Smith. Ellie, played by Thomasin McKenzie, is a young fashion student who loves the 1960s and has just moved to London. She rents a bedsit in an old house, and when she goes to sleep, she dreams that she is Sandy, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, an aspiring singer and dancer in 1960s Soho. As Ellie travels deeper into Sandy's world, she finds that she was a real person and that something terrible might have happened to her at the hands of her talent manager and pimp, Jack, played by Matt Smith. We saw this film recently. Nick, what did you think of it?
I liked that Edgar Wright is trying something different, although I'm not sure it entirely works. Honestly, it's kind of, I think, possibly a similar point of view to Baby Driver, in that it's very attractive, it looks and sounds great, as you'd expect from an Edgar Wright movie. And to be fair, the fundamental ghost story is a decent plot, with a decent twist at the end, which hits the right sort of twist markers of, I didn't see this coming, but it works. There's a couple of slightly silly bits towards the end as well, but the fundamental twist, I think, works. But I also came out of it with a similar problem, to Baby Driver, in that it's basically well made and a lot of the markers are there, but I didn't quite connect with the characters. The dialogue often feels a bit soapy and on the nose, and the film often seems kind of reluctant to get particularly deep into the misogyny, which is kind of the fundamental point of it. I mean, obviously I'm not, particularly out to go out of an evening and have extreme brutal misogyny shoved in my face, but I don't really know. It seems to very much be a film about misogyny that wanted to show as little on-camera misogyny as possible, except for this sort of quite broad cartoon version, which I found quite thin.
Yeah, I agree with that there is definitely the same flaws that Baby Driver had. I'm kind of concerned that my take on Last Night in Soho is going to be weirdly similar to my take on The Eternals, which on some level is that this is very interesting and beautiful to look at, and it's a great sort of thing to experience on the big screen, but it kind of lacks depth. Although maybe I did enjoy this a bit more than Eternals and felt that there was something more going on, because I guess it had this kind of 60s aesthetic and the kind of critique of the 60s built into it. My favourite thing about this film is Edgar Wright's visual style. I mean, a big fan of his work ever since Spaced and then Shaun of the Dead and all the films he's made along the way. And he's always doing something visually interesting, and there's brilliant production design in this film. He's really brought the 60s to life in a very considered, precise, vivid way. In some ways, I think he's dialed back his trademark, very distinctive visual style. There's fewer crash zooms and rapid pans. It's more about kind of bringing out the sort of sense and sort of feel of the 60s. And again, all the classic nods are there. References to other films, including like Psycho at one point and things. Amazing soundtrack. He's obviously got a great ear for music, and especially music of this period, and it's woven in, in sort of a kind of deft way, and that really works. But most of these are kind of like surface things. Like, again, characters aren't particularly complex. There's not a huge sort of character evolution, similar to also with Baby Driver. There's not huge depth to the characters. So I, did feel that, although it's beautiful to look at, it's leaves you unsatisfied on some level.
I think the thing with Eternals is that, not to accidentally start reviewing Eternals again, but as I sort of said when we did that, Chloe Zhao's shots have this sort of cold blue beauty to them. It's definitely gorgeously shot, but it's not warm. It doesn't pull you in quite the same way, whereas this is quite immersive attractiveness. It's very colourful. It sort of spins around you, and because there's only two main characters really, and everyone else is relatively thin, it could get at least under their skin a bit more. Although, as we've both now said, the problem with this film is that it doesn't quite get under their skin enough. And especially with, as you say, the gimmick is, there's a present-day lead and a past lead. And the present-day lead, Ellie, played by Thomasin McKenzie, her story just doesn't quite... To be honest, it gets a bit repetitive. There's just a bit too much of her. She gets up, she goes out, she has a freak out, she has an awkward chat with her one friend who tries to comfort her, and she freaks out on him, runs away, goes back to bed, and has another dream about Sandy. That happens, it feels like about 3 or 4 times. I might be over-counting, but it felt like that seemed to happen a lot. And it didn't really feel like that story quite developed in a smooth, organic way. Sandy's story was slightly more thinly drawn because she gets less screen time, but at least developed slightly more clearly. Yeah,
that is one of the issues with this film, is that at its core is Ellie, who's not particularly complex or deep character. She's a kind of one-note character in that she's sort of meek and fragile. She's from the countryside, and London's a bit much for her, and she's sort of shy and withdrawn. And Thomasin McKenzie, I think, does a great performance and really conveys, I've met people, especially when you go to university and you're kind of finding yourself who, are kind of shy and introverted and maybe a bit meek, but there isn't a lot of kind of character journey or character progression from Ellie. She kind of gets to the end of the film and she's maybe found some confidence, but there's not really much else going on in there. So, and then the other characters are also not very complex. So Sandy's is a bit more interesting, but also at heart she's a woman who wants to be a singer and an actress and a dancer, and that's kind of the core of her character. So some more depth, I think, would have been good. And
it doesn't really go in an unexpected direction either. Was anyone watching this film meant to think that Matt Smith's character wasn't a wrong-un basically as soon as he appeared?
I mean, I think that's obvious.
There's a part of me who's like, is this is it meant to be a twist that he's going to turn out to be a baddie and probably also her pimp? Because it seems quite obvious.
But that's deliberate, I'm sure. You're supposed to be, from the second he appears, you're sort of vaguely suspect of him. And that's something that Matt Smith does very well. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, even though he was like younger than David Tennant when he played the Doctor, he was much better at David Tennant than the kind of darker moments of the Doctor, the kind of, you stupid humans, what have you done? You're destroying yourselves. Matt Smith, he can bring like a darkness to his performances. And he does that very well here. He kind of balances his character. He can be charming, he can be suave, he can be seductive, but there's also an edge of an edge to his performance. So yeah, I mean, all the cast are doing very well here, but yeah, Matt Smith again, he does genuinely creepy and unpleasant quite well.
Yeah, maybe what you needed was more creepy, unpleasant things happening to the lead instead of her just going through this well-made enough but kind of generic university experiences and having freakouts. I don't know, maybe she needs to have some sort of horrible experience with misogyny as well instead of just quite dull life. I don't know.
Yeah, I think they're trying to explore with Ellie's character that she's got mental health problems because her mother died, and that's kind of the kind of thing that informs her character. And there's sort of various bits when the mother appears, and what I do like about it is that it keeps ambiguous whether she is really seeing the mother's ghost or it's just a memory or a reflection of her trauma. It makes it very clear that Sandy's a real person, and she is, through these dreams in this haunted strange bedsit she's in, she's time traveling into the past and experiencing actual events. But there's a distinction between Ellie's sort of trauma and Sandy's world that she gets mixed up in, which is an interesting level of ambiguity. And then the kind of the Sandy character plotline has some interesting twists, which we probably shouldn't spoil for people who haven't seen it, but they were at least surprising when they came.
Yeah, when the twists finally arrived, I assume you're talking about like the big final twists at the very end.
There's a couple. There's one that's about at the kind of 4/5 way into the film, and then there's one right at the end. And both of those, I think, are surprising twists.
Yeah, now, as I say, I think the basic ghost story plot and the couple of big twists, especially the very big one at the end, are, I think, one of the big things that work in this film, and did mean I came away with it thinking, yeah, I still don't think the characters work. And yeah, for a film that's about misogyny, it seems very keen to avoid looking directly at it a lot of the time. Like, a lot of its horror is quite generic. Like, I don't know if those faceless men in suits are quite as scary as Edgar Wright thinks they are. They just kept turning up.
Yeah, I mean, they were tense, and they added to the tension of the film. Yeah, I mean, they're a good sort of thing to increasing the horror. I guess, like we were saying, about Invasion, there comes a point when you show sort of dark, creepy things to people, but you have to kind of pull back the curtain and reveal the true awfulness. And for whatever reason, it's kind of obliquely shown to you.
Yeah, it's a strange film which is basically about sex work, but again does not want to put it on screen very much. Like, it's shown very vaguely in montage.
Yeah, so I guess that's one of the flaws of the film, that, it implies that something terrible has happened to Sandy, but it doesn't use that to kind of increase the horror or the sort of scare factor of the film.
Edgar Wright, I assume, has been aware that people have commented on the lack of strong female characters in his films, or like, I don't know, not strong female characters in the generic fantasy character sense, but, memorable or deep female characters in his films. Obviously, he's now made a film about two women, which seems like a conscious effort to deal with that, but unfortunately, they're not his strongest or deepest characters.
No. I think there is something thematically complex or interesting going on here, which is, I guess, kind of the core of the film, which is that Ellie is, she's presented as maybe slightly naive, not very worldly teenager. There aren't many 18-year-olds who are worldly or not naive. Yeah, and she's got a lot of nostalgia. She's in love with the past, and especially like this kind of 1960s London, or this certain small scene that has been very influential in pop culture, but was actually a sort of small niche at the time, the kind of what you think of as the iconic 1960s London. And she's got very much a sort of nostalgia view that music was better in the past, fashion was better in the past. She wants to be a designer, but is so heavily influenced by the 1960s. And a lot of people have this view that, pop culture was better in the past and things like that. And I do remember when I went to university, I listened to a lot of sort of music from the 60s and stuff, and films and things, and had this kind of view of like, music was better in the past, films were better in the past. And what people forget about the past is, how misogynistic it was, the way women were treated, how sort of unpleasant it was, because nostalgia kind of papers over that. And it is a film about someone with a naive, nostalgic view of the past travels into it and discovers how unpleasant it was. The darker side that, in her naivety and her nostalgia, she's she's overlooked, and especially, as a woman, needs to reckon with what the 60s was really like. And there is, a commentary on a lot of teenage nostalgia for a time that people didn't live through. The kind of flaw of the film is that when it gets to the end, and this isn't a huge spoiler, she's still infatuated with the 60s. I don't think has she learnt anything about the true nature of the 60s when it gets to the end, because there is an interesting commentary on nostalgia in this film. I just don't think it quite lands it right at the end.
Yeah, there are some weird aspects to the ending, which I would struggle to describe without spoiling them. Although it is actually one of, I think, the more successful bits. There's a nice sort of sinister horror vibe in the final scene, which actually, I think, lands quite well. But yeah, you are right about the slight confusion about what it may or may not be trying to say about nostalgia. Like, I think fundamentally the message about the sinister undertone of it is probably meant to be in there, although I'm not sure how well it actually comes across.
Yeah, I mean, I did relate to it on the level of, I was someone who had, nostalgic infatuation with the 60s, and did have to be told that, like, especially by women that I knew, that, like, you are aware, like, how misogynistic and how bad it was for women, You might think it would have been great to go to Beatles concerts in the early days or whatever, or hang around Soho when it was the most glamorous place in the world, but it was not great for women. And, the film makes that point well.
Yeah, no, I think that point is in there. One of the weird thing I have for this film is it's almost so attractively shot, but it sits a bit weirdly with the sort of slightly on-the-nose horrorness of the film. I don't know whether that's a valid point or if I'm just rambling.
I mean, it's supposed to be a straight-up horror film.
Yeah.
It's described as a horror movie. It's not supposed to be like a time travel murder mystery. I mean, Edgar Wright is known for, like, bending genres, especially in his Three Flavors Cornetto trilogy, and, in lots of other things that he's done, like Scott Pilgrim is, is mixing genres. So, but this is the most straight-up genre piece that he's done. It's a horror movie. It's supposed to be scary.
Yeah, maybe that's what I'm bumping on, but it doesn't quite go far enough into the darkness to be properly terrifying. I don't know.
If you're a fan of Edgar Wright's visual style and the care and delicacy he puts into making his films, definitely go see this, because it's an example of him doing beautiful visuals, excellent music, amazing soundtrack, a beautiful production design, really interesting visual style. And it is, again, I guess, similar to Eternals. It's flawed, but it's flawed in an interesting way that's worth exploring. It's one that will be memorable if it's not like, I guess, a masterpiece.
Yeah, this does seem to be a bit of a themed interesting failure week on Moderate Fantasy Violence. Oh well. Thank you for listening to this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did particularly enjoy it, you can go to our website and find still more content at moderatefantasyviolence.com, including various articles by Alistair and, of course, our entire archive of, scarily, now almost 150 episodes. If you want to reward us for this superhuman feat of endurance, you can go to your podcast application of choice and leave a review if they let you do that. 5 stars, please. Thank you.
You can find more from us on Twitter, where we are at MFV Podcast, and you can find more from us on Facebook by searching for Moderate Fantasy Violence. You can find more from me on Twitter, where I'm at Alistair J.R. Ball, and you can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com.
And you can find more from me at nickbryan.com or as at nickmb on Twitter. If you're at the Thought Bubble Comic Convention in Harrogate next weekend, that's the 13th, 14th, then I should be tabling there selling my various comics, assuming I manage not to get COVID in the next 5 days. So check my Twitter feed to check I didn't get COVID, and if you're there, come along. And then, of course, come back for the next and, as I hinted just now, 150th episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, and to celebrate this terrifying milestone, we'll be doing one of our classic pandemic-era all-Netflix episodes. This time, it's the new Western The Harder They Fall, starring Idris Elba, and the Army of the Dead spin-off prequel thing, Army of Thieves. Exciting celebratory stuff. See you then for that. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
What was I trying to say? Composing.